Welcome to the 102nd episode of the Reading and Writing Podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Rutherford. Stay tuned for my interview with Stephen Romano, author of the new thriller novel, Resurrection Express. I also wanted to mention at the outset and just remind you, if you have not reviewed the podcast in iTunes yet, if you could just take a minute or two and leave me a review in iTunes. The reason that I ask that is not for my own ego, but it helps other people find the podcast. So if you have found this podcast and these interviews helpful to you or interesting, if you could just take a minute or two, go to iTunes and leave a quick review of the podcast. I appreciate it. And now on to the interview with Stephen Romano, author of Resurrection Express. Thanks. Welcome back to the Reading and Writing Podcast. My guest today is Stephen Romano, author of the new novel Resurrection Express. Resurrection Express has received rave reviews from many noted suspense and thriller writers, including Greg Rucka, Blake Crouch, Tom Piccirilli, and many others. Stephen, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Jeff. How are you doing?
Good. Well, first, can I ask you to read the first 3 or 4 paragraphs of Resurrection Express?
Oh, my God. Why would you want me to do that? Yes, absolutely. It starts with kind of a mission statement, if you will. That's like a very short paragraph, and then it goes to the first chapter proper. So that's what you'll be getting. You'll be getting the sort of, the kind of thought inside his head first, and then you'll be getting the first action scene. So,
sure.
Here we go. Everyone wants to believe they can be saved. Everyone wants to take it to the promised land. Everyone wants to know that they are the heroes of their own lives, that it all means something in the end, that they are righteous in the face of so many mistakes and sins. Everyone wants to be resurrected. A lot of us die very disappointed. Tony, I will resurrect you. Chapter 1, 5%. My fist connects with a soft spot in Cooley's right cheek just above his lower jaw, and I hear teeth shatter under my knuckles. I hit him just the way you're supposed to, arm straight out, wrist stiff like steel, all forward thrust, anchored from the shoulder and popped like a coiled spring at my elbow. You turn your whole arm into a concrete piston when you do that. This guy, he's big and all, but big doesn't mean anything when you go straight for the face. A monster can't grow muscles on his teeth. Giant guys who are used to victory by intimidation never expect it to come right at them like this, not ever. Cooley stumbles back all dazed, the knockout reflex working overtime. I hit him next in the throat, a jiu-jitsu-style straight jab with my fingers. His windpipe closes with a sick crack, and he loses all his air. When he drops the shank and reaches up to grab his throat, I kick him dead center just below the belt. That cancels the fight. But just to be sure and to make it nice and showy for the boys, I swing around again with the heel of my foot, and something that looks like a big red tomato bomb explodes in the center of his face. He goes down on the dirty asphalt, dreaming about whatever. The crowd goes crazy, like it's a football game. The smell of blood crawls up my nose, sharp and wet and stinging, like salt water dripping from a rusty razor. I never get used to that. I always avoid it. But some things are inevitable.
Great. Well, if the listeners haven't heard about Resurrection Express yet, how would you describe the novel?
Well, it's a fast action thriller with a kind of mystery at its heart, and it's very romantic in its own way. It's a first person narrative, obviously. It's very tough. It's very uncompromising, but it also appeals to a lot of people. I think I've noticed that a lot of women seem to be really plugging into it. The main character is this sort of hopeless romantic trapped in the body of a very skilled criminal professional, and he's very well trained at robbing banks and doing computerized heists, and so he's very much in demand by the criminal underworld. He's also very good with his hands and feet, as you just heard. He's very good. He's very good at defending himself and attacking people if he needs to. But he's also not a killer. His father is a killer, so there's this legacy that's been passed down to him. And he's very obsessed with the memory of his dead wife when the thing starts. And he's been shot in the face and is recovered from that. And so he developed a form of face blindness that prevents him from seeing any memories that are fully formed of his wife. And so he's kind of like half mad when we first catch up with him, and he's in prison. And he gets out of prison, and he goes on that one last heist, and it turns out that his wife may or may not still be alive, and he gets in a lot of trouble, and it escalates until it kind of evolves from a claustrophobic chase thriller into something far more epic and insidious and world-threatening. So I've been referring to it as The Getaway meets Mission Impossible by way of Jason Bourne, directed by Quentin Tarantino. And I use the film analogy more than anything else because it's a very cinematic book. It's very involving. It gets you right from the beginning, and you feel like you're watching a film. You feel like you're kind of experiencing it.
Great. Well, I know that you've written original screenplays and screenplays adapting short stories and other work. Did Resurrection Express start out originally as a screenplay for you?
It did and it didn't. I kind of stole some ideas from an old screenplay that I had written with a gentleman named Brian Gear, whom I dedicated the book to, by the way, many years ago, back in 1990. But it didn't have any of the characters or the situations or anything. I just took a couple of ideas that actually were mine all along, and I kind of transplanted them into this other story. But other than that, no, it wasn't. It was a completely original project that I developed when I was working with an editor at Little Brown and Company in 2010, and actually the entire intent of the project was not to do a film thing, to do something that would be a novel that might be good to be made into a movie later. But I was very interested in getting back into pure fiction because I'd had a few very frustrating years as a screenwriter. As a screenwriter, the biggest hazard that you have is that you work a lot, if you're lucky, of course, but you don't see a lot of your stuff made into movies. A lot of it goes on the shelves because studio executives, they live to red light movies, right? Because they want to keep their jobs. Most movies fail, just like most books fail, and no one wants to take the blame for that. So they turn things down left and right. And when they greenlight something, everybody's always afraid for their jobs. So you end up kind of, holding the bag, so to speak. They pay you pretty good, but you don't have much of a career, really. It's like a phantom career. So I was very interested in writing more books and, being able to talk about them like this with gentlemen such as yourself.
Sure. Well, when you sat down to write the novel, what was the writing process like for you? Did you know exactly where you were going with the book, or did it unfold while you were writing?
I tend to write in a manner that unfolds as I write it. I actually did do an outline for Resurrection Express, but I find that writing in that way, where you sort of put an outline in front of you and try to follow it, it's nice for your peace of mind at the time while you're outlining it, and it probably is good for the editor that you may or may not be working with, because they can see what your plan is. But it really, to me, it's the depth of art to think in that way, because what happens is you get going on a trajectory when you're actually writing it. This is what happens for me anyway. And you find that it takes you in all of these new directions. You find that the characters open their mouths and start speaking in their own languages and in their own words, rather. And they want you to do things, and you have no control over it. Stephen King always refers to it as finding found objects, because that's how he writes also. And a lot of writers do that. William Gibson does that too. And a lot of other writers like Warren Ellis can't understand it at all, because those guys live to outline things. They're comic book writers mostly. Right. And so they have to outline stuff. They have to outline stuff years in advance, because they're writing like Transmetropolitan, for example, which had a whole story trajectory mapped out in advance. But for me, writing a thriller like Resurrection Express with just tons of twists and turns and things that are going to grab the audience by surprise, you have to surprise yourself while you're writing it. Otherwise, it doesn't work. And so that's. I went into it with an idea of what it was and where it was going to go eventually. but I even deviated in certain ways from that as I was writing it. But I kept to the basic idea and the basic heart of the story and the character. And to me, whenever I write a book like this, which is very full of worldview and attitude in the first person sense, that voice is always the most important thing, and that's where you're going to find some really wonderful things.
Sure. Well, I wanted to talk about your book, Shock Festival, which you wrote several years ago. And for those listening that haven't heard about it, Shock Festival is very different than the straight ahead thriller Resurrection Express. With Shock Festival, you basically wrote and created a huge coffee table book with 600 illustrations about fictional B-movie filmmakers and creators. I'm just curious about first of all, did I describe it correctly? And second of all, what led you to that creation of Shock Festival?
Well, first of all, yes, you did describe it pretty accurately. And second of all, I am, when I'm not writing, and sometimes even when I am writing, I'm a huge fan of exploitation cinema. I love these crappy movies. And part of the biggest appeal of exploitation film, I think almost 60 to 70% of it, is the advertising hype. I so wish that I could have lived in New York during the days of the 42nd Street, Times Square, Grindhouse, because those places were like the most beautiful. That would have been like Oz to me, like walking down the street and seeing all those marquees, like one after the other, with all this beautiful artwork, the posters and the lobby cards and the day bills, and they would plaster all those theaters with. And I've been fascinated with movie poster art forever. And I was around to see the video age start in the early 80s, where it was a similar kind of hard sell, where they had everything out on VHS tape back then, even more so than is on any other format to this day. And you'd go in the video store and you get suckered in by the most beautiful boxes. Charlie Band was a master of doing all of that, and his companies like Wizard Video and whatever else, and Full Moon nowadays, but like back then he had Empire Pictures. And so the whole sleazy allure of movie poster art for exploitation films has just been a big deal in my life. And if you were in my house right now, you would see that my entire living space, every wall in my abode is covered in that kind of movie exploitation artwork. But my wallpaper is literally just one poster after another. So I've been fascinated with that, and I've always wanted to do a book of movie posters for films that didn't exist, which just seems like a no-brainer. What a neat idea! It's like a great idea for an art book. Mm-hmm. And then I was talking about the idea to my friend who you mentioned earlier, Tom Piccirilli, who's a brilliant writer and a good friend of mine. And he suggested the idea of doing short stories or something to go with the posters. And I thought, well, wait a minute. What if these movies actually did exist, and there was a whole history that spanned, the 2 or 3 decades I'm very familiar with in terms of exploitation film, because I'm a pretty knowledgeable person about that stuff. So I started thinking about it and thinking about it and thinking about it, and then I just developed this incredible, harebrained scheme to do hundreds of movie posters and then try to come up with a actual historical backstory for the entire thing. And that's what I did. I wrote it kind of as a novel, except that it's done in the style of one of those coffee table books that you see at your friend's house or at your house or whatever, and you open it up and it's got all these learned essays and stories and behind-the-scenes interviews and so forth with these people who made these movies, and plus it's all full of posters and behind-the-scenes pictures and everything. So it's completely convincing. It's like Spinal Tap meets Grindhouse, and it ended up being such an original idea that it was a real hard sell. But eventually, I managed to put it out, and that was 2 years of my life, because it was such a massive art requirement. I actually had to learn how to do the artwork myself, and it was a real undertaking, and I'm really, really proud of it. It's one of the better things I've ever been involved with.
Wow. And who ended up publishing that?
It was co-branded by IDW, Idea and Design Works, in San Diego, California, and another company called Raw Entertainment.
Gotcha. Well, when you were younger, you started out originally as a rock and roll musician. What led you to writing screenplays and novels? Is that something you always wanted to do, even when you were performing music?
Yeah, of course. I that was my first love. I saw Star Wars when I was 7 years old, and it knocked the hell out of me. I wanted to do movies after that. Um, and I've always been a reader and all of this, so yeah, I've always wanted to put on a show in some form or another. Being a rock musician was just sort of a natural offshoot of the environment that I was raised in. My father was literally one of those bubblegum rock and rollers from the 60s that are so kind of in vogue with the retro guys these days, like guys like the Zombies and the Turtles and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, my father was in a band that had a top 40 radio hit in LA called "You're the Grooviest Girl in the World." And it's amazing. They have an album. The name of their band was Elephant Candy, and they had I'm sorry, it wasn't Elephant Candy. It was the Fun and Games, and their album was called Elephant Candy. When you look that stuff up, it's just amazing. They performed songs that were written by their producer and everything. It was a situation where rock is my father. It kind of I don't know. He sort of sold his soul to Hollywood to be one of these teeny bopper rockers, and he hated it so much that he ended up buying back his contract, and then he became a blues guy in Houston, Texas, where he was born and raised. And he rubbed shoulders with guys like Stevie Ray Vaughan and Lucinda Williams, who were all friends of ours. And Lyle Lovett. In fact, I think Rock just did a session with Lyle not too long ago. And it was this thriving music community, and not to be a part of that probably would have been ridiculous. So I had a band. I was a teenager, and we went out to clubs and we'd play. We were like these 16-year-old kids, and we would open up for all the popular bands in town at the time. And it was a real sowing your wild oats period. But it was, it was never something that I think I was destined to do 100% professionally, even though later in my career I did do audio comic books. I did do a couple of other music-related things. But the writing is what I was put on this earth to do,
Gotcha.
for whatever reason. Yeah.
So what tips or advice would you offer for aspiring writers or filmmakers or screenwriters?
Never give up. Never, ever give up. That's the best advice anybody can give anybody about anything. Joe Lansdale, who's one of my mentors and one of my heroes, someone asked him that question, and he said, "Put your ass in a chair and write." That's rule number one. And rule number two, see rule number one. You got to produce. You can't just spend 3 years writing that first novel and expect to sell that and then become a famous writer overnight. You've got to be able to produce work, on a consistent level, and it's got to be good too. So, I've spent years training myself to just sit down and do it, and that's the number one advice. And don't be discouraged if your first novel doesn't fly, and keep at it. And because usually every first novel doesn't fly. I just did a blog recently, a guest blog at a website where I talked about my first book, which I actually published in a vanity run myself because nobody wanted it. But I tell you, I got some great advice from one of the guys who rejected it. So you learn from all these experiences, and you let it evolve. When I was working on Resurrection Express, I eventually had to put it away for a while because I had another offer to work with Patrick Melton and Marcus Dunstan, the writers of the Saw films, on a novel called Blacklight, which came out last year. And it was really heartbreaking for me to put away Resurrection Express, but I had to do it because it was where my career was going at the time. And then everything worked out at the end of the day. So there's a reason for everything, and you let yourself evolve through it, and always learn. And don't ever think you're old enough to learn something from anybody. That's another thing is that we are creatures that are gifted on this earth of having brains, and we can evolve unlike other animals who will only ever be tigers or whatever else for the rest of their lives. So we are creatures of vision, and so use that vision.
Great. That's great advice. So what books, fiction or nonfiction, have you read lately that made an impact on you and that you would recommend?
I got to tell you, I recently, a lady I know turned me on to Francesca Leah Block, who is actually technically a young adult writer.
Mm-hmm.
But she's one of these writers who transcends her genre, and she's just absolutely amazing. And Stephanie turned me on to this book called Girl Goddess Number 9, which is a collection of short stories, and it's absolutely devastating and amazing and like so grown up and sophisticated that you realize just how conservative the publishing industry is, because they tend to pigeonhole things if they're about girls or if they're about this or whatever. And I highly recommend Francesca Leah Block. I just got into her this year. It's not thriller stuff, but it's really amazing, mostly slice of life, very sort of emphatic, kids in turmoil kind of things. And it's not condescending at all. It ranks up there with the best literature I've ever read. And that's another thing you should know about me, is that I don't draw any dividing lines between much of anything. Mm-hmm. One of my favorite movies of all time is a terrible Italian science fiction film called Star Crash, because I see art in it. I really love that movie. And people look at you really funny and they back away slowly and they say, "What the fuck is wrong with you?" I'm sorry, can I say that?
That's fine.
I didn't ask you if I could swear on this thing.
That's fine.
But Francisca is awesome, and I read Game Change recently because I saw the movie with Ed Harris. It was about the elections.
Right.
I thought that was a pretty informative book. It's a little dry, but it was very informative. That kind of political stuff just fascinates me. And recently I was compared to an author named Charlie Huston, who, oddly enough, I'd never read before. And we have a very similar style, and so I picked up his book Caught Stealing, and I really, really enjoyed it. And Tom Piccirilli, again, to bring him up again, he wrote a book recently, he didn't write it recently, but it came out recently, called The Last Kind Words, which is just amazing. That guy is just one of the great unsung heroes of the entire literary world. I can't recommend Tom highly enough.
Great. Well, what are you working on now? What are you writing now?
Right now, I just finished work on a Resurrection sequel, because we'll have another Elroy Coffin adventure. For those of you that haven't read the book, Elroy Coffin is the name of the character in Resurrection Express. So we'll be getting a sequel to that, and then I have another thing, which is a standalone book, and yet another thing after that, which is a bit of a top-secret project. And then I have Blacklight the movie with Patrick Melton and Marcus Dunstan. As a matter of fact, Patrick and Marcus are in town right now for Fantastic Fest, and they're showing their new movie, The Collective. And we've been palling around, and I've been driving them all over the place and being the designated driver while they get drunk at the after parties. But I've been very fortunate to be involved with them. And we wrote this book together, and Michael DeLuca has it currently under his wing, and he's fostering it to be a feature film. So we're working on that too. So there's a lot going on. That's great. Well, where can people find you online? I'm at www.stephenromanoshockfestival.com. And if you forget that, just Google my name. It's always the first hit that comes up. My website is a fun place to go. And I'll have a link in the show notes as well that people can check out. Well, again, we've been speaking with Stephen Romano, author of the new novel Resurrection Express. It's available in bookstores now. You should definitely check it out. Stephen, thanks for doing the interview. Oh, thank you very much, John.
Parent, volunteer, employee. With your different roles and busy schedule, how can you find time to complete the degree you once started? Cornerstone University's programs are designed for busy adults like you. Take one course at a time, back-to-back, to move through your degree quickly. Attend through an on-campus, live stream, or 100% online format, whichever works best for you. If you're ready to go further in your goals, we're here to make it possible. Achieve without ceasing. Learn more at adult.cornerstone.edu.
Hear that? Is that America cheering or a sausage patty sizzling to perfection? It's time to cheer for Egg McMuffin and fresh cracked eggs at McDonald's. It's time to wake up to the aroma of freshly baked biscuits and treat yourself to a real honest-to-goodness morning meal. Breakfast, it's on at McDonald's. Now enjoy a large iced coffee for just $2. Add a breakfast sandwich to make a meal. Prices and participation may vary. Cannot be combined with any other offer or combo meal.